Good afternoon from London, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just take a couple of minutes to allow everybody to join the call. Yeah, so a very warm afternoon from London, but I think where most of you are joining us from, it's probably morning where you are. So a good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar, which is all about people over processes. So we're looking at building human-centered systems that empower users to access services. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former senior civil servant here in the UK, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum that serves civil servants all around the world. And also, I'd like to say thank you to our knowledge partner today, which is NAVA. So, in terms of this topic that we're covering today, as governments around the world continue to evolve on their digital transformation programs, it's true to say that the accessibility challenges that they have faced for a long time are also shifting to that online domain. In America, in particular, the US government has developed accessibility rules known as Section 508. But often these rules alone are not sufficient on their own. So many departments and agencies are also looking to things like more agile approaches that are rooted in human-centered design, in citizen-centered design, to ensure that their new systems and their digital platforms are built with those users' needs right up front from the start. So in this webinar, we're going to be looking at all of the issues related to this topic. So things like how to ensure that in the public sector, we're building and testing accessibilities in government websites, how different digital identities and credentials can be built into these systems in accessible ways, and how to modernize those underlying processes and structures to make sure that government services are as accessible and inclusive as possible. We have four fantastic speakers with us here today, and in a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers and then get into a conversation by putting a few questions to our panel. But today is as much a conversation that we want you to be involved in as just me speaking to our speakers. So at any point from now on, you should see on the device that you are using a Q&A function. Please use that function from any point now to message in your questions and your comments, and we'll come to those throughout the conversation and make sure we get to as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. So, in terms of our great speakers, we have Andrew Nielsen, who I might refer to as we have two Andrews. I might refer to Andrew as Drew from this point forward. So, Drew is the director of the government-wide IT accessibility programme in GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy, which has the mandate to provide technical assistance to federal agencies and individuals in meeting those Section 508 requirements. Drew is an expert in the field of information and communications technology accessibility. He's co-chair of the annual ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium, which brings together experts from around the world in the field of ICT accessibility testing. And he was also the facilitator of the interagency team of experts that developed both the baseline and the current version of the Trusted Tester process, which is recognised across the federal government as leading practice in accessibility testing. Then we also have Dr. Mavourneen Dollar, who is the Director of Product Management at Bloomberg Government, where she spearheads product strategy and roadmap development for innovative client-facing applications. Mavourneen has a background spanning government, non-profits and the private sector, and she brings a wealth of experience in human-centered design and data-driven product management. As the former Chief Product Officer for the Medicare payment system, she led the modernisation of payment systems operations for the world's largest health insurer, focusing on user needs and agile methodologies. And she also served as product strategy and operations lead at the US Digital Service within the Department of Veterans Affairs, where she provided strategic direction to support the modernization of the veterans appeals processing. So great to have that private and public sector kind of experience. And then we have Andrew Drummond, who is State Director of Accessibility at the Maryland Department of Information Technology. With over 15 years of dedicated leadership in the field, Andrew has built a strong track record in championing accessibility, particularly in information technology. Certified as an accessibility professional by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, he served as an expert witness in legal and administrative proceedings, and he authored the State of Maryland's first comprehensive digital accessibility policy, which was announced by the governor in January 2024, so earlier this year. Andrew has shared his expertise on national platforms, conferences, televised panel discussions within the technology industry, and has lectured on digital accessibility at local universities. So great to have your experience with us here today, Andrew. And then last but by no means least, we have Jody Leo, who is the Chief Delivery Officer at NAVA. And NAVA is a public benefit corporation which emerged from the effort to help rebuild healthcare.gov after its launch, and which now works with partners across the public sector to make government services simple, effective, and accessible to all. And Jody is responsible for marshalling the company's core capabilities in engineering, design, project, program, and product management. And she spent the last 10 years establishing highly effective organizations, helping them scale, cultivating leadership, and articulating a vision for the future. Previously, Jody spent 15 years deep in the delivery environment with users, teams, and stakeholders for companies like Apple and Mozilla. And she's a professor at the School of Visual Arts Masters Interactive Design, where she trains future digital services talent. So we really do have an amazing panel of speakers with us here today. As I say, please take this opportunity to make this your webinar as much as ours, and to make this a conversation and message in your questions and comments as we go along. But I want to kick off the conversation, and I've got a kind of opening question really to put to all of you. So we're talking about kind of making human-centered systems. So my question's a very simple one really. And Drew, I'm going to come to you first on this one. So based both on where you are now, but also any previous experience that you want to bring in from previous roles, how well do you think that accessibility is being designed into policy development and service delivery, especially as we're going through this kind of digital transformation process?
Thank you, Siobhan. I think that we are seeing some promising trends, in particular in policy, from the highest level of the U.S. federal government in specific memos, directives to agencies to highlight the importance and to really make digital accessibility core of our conception of digital experience, as an example. With that said, we have a lot of room for improvement. So some may be aware that Congress, coming up on a couple of years ago now, tasked OMB and GSA with consultation with the community members and the U.S. Access Board in particular, to conduct, to devise assessment criteria for agencies and then to produce a report based on responses from agencies. And I'll share maybe just a couple highlights to give us some indication of where we currently are as a baseline, and maybe some indication about where, at least in the federal government, where we need to go. So we asked agencies a number of questions, and maybe to broadly characterize it, we asked agencies about conformance to the U.S. accessibility standards, the Section 508 standards, for particular types of information and communication technology. And we also asked them about particular characteristics and practices that might indicate some maturity in implementing the Section 508 requirements. And if you could envision a grid comparing the axes of conformance and maturity, we had a 5-point scale on each of those axes, conformance and maturity, from very low to very low, low, moderate, high, and very high in terms of maturity and conformance. And 76% of the responding entities, we had 249 responding entities or agencies that gave us data about in response to those questions, and 76% fell in the lowest portion of that grid, meaning from very low to only moderate in both maturity and conformance. So the remaining 24% were somewhere above that. And so that's obviously huge room for improvement. Focusing on some particular conformance data, we asked agencies also to report on how well or how conformant their most viewed web content is, their top 10 most viewed web pages,
Yeah.
their top 5 most viewed videos and electronic documents. And less than 30% of those assets were fully conformant to the Section 5 WHOIS standards.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't tell the whole story. There might be content that closely approaches full conformance, but only 30% fully conformed across those top viewed most viewed assets or web content. So again, the huge room for improvement, but again, we are seeing some promising trends. More agencies are devoting attention and resources, and again, with the priority and imperatives from the executive, from the White House, we're seeing more and greater emphasis, and so we are starting to see some cultural shift as well.
Yeah.
But the very beginnings of that.
Yeah.
In particular in the priority. So that's from my perspective, some indication of kind of where we are and some of the things that are starting to go well while we have large room for improvement.
Thanks, Drew. So as you say, lots of room for improvement there. Interesting, very interesting what you say about those most viewed pages, the compliance of those pages being less than 30%. So really there is quite a lot of room for improvement. I was going to follow up, and I will with all of you once you've all kind of talked about where you think you are, on maybe what some of the biggest challenges are and why you're not seeing higher levels of conformity. But you already touched on a couple of issues there, I think, around the leadership that's required and the cultural change that's required. So maybe we'll come back to some of those issues in terms of what are some of the barriers to this. Thanks so much, Drew, for kicking us off. Mavourneen, I'm going to come to you. So does that kind of resonate with you, what Andrew's saying? And do you, what's your sense of where we are? And I guess you have now this experience both from being within the public sector and now looking at it from outside as well, looking in.
I do. Thank you, Siobhan. And I just want to acknowledge my co-panelists, right? Everybody here is a true expert in accessibility standards. And my perspective is a little bit different, right? Coming in as a product person, started my career as an environmental policy strategist and an advisor. And I sort of had this kind of growing understanding of the complexities that you just touched on in terms of the place we are in the journey. And I think the most important takeaway that I have from Drew's readout is that we are in fact on the journey, right? We have taken the first steps and we want to start running and we want to get there. We want to get to that finish line. And I think we should definitely continue to have urgency around it and have mandates and kind of ask agencies that are, public dollars to continue to improve. But I think the fact that we're on the journey is the most important thing. And there's a lot of complexities there, right? And I think it sounds a little bit banal, but one interesting thing I heard earlier this year was somebody said, if everybody in any country had to deal with public services as they exist today, they would improve immediately, right? A lot of us have connections within various agencies. So when we need a passport expedited, we know who to reach out to human. We don't have to go into the form that we may or may not be able to understand, may or may not be able to see, may not be able to click on the right thing, etc. We can just call somebody. And everybody else does not have that access, right? Using that word in that other way, right? And so I think that's a mental model that I've been using and trying to share with other people is imagine if you had to go through what everybody else has to go through without any of your connections, any of your well-earned connections, but still those connections. And I definitely assumed early in my career that if something was in a design system, it was accessible because why would you? Like, it's kind of like all of those people that used various SQL queries and database setups and then realized, oh, SQL injection can still happen despite that. So I think there's an analog there where just because something exists, just because there's a module and a template that you can copy, doesn't necessarily mean that it meets these standards. And I think there's one of the interesting lenses that I've heard people describe is that making things accessible makes them better for everybody else. And I think that's an important message. But I also think that there's a message around just decency for our fellow humans.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it doesn't help you too. It's just decent. It's just the right thing to do. So let's just do the right thing. So that's a little bit of me on my high horse, and I'll get off it, maybe.
Marvin, thank you so much. I love what you say, because I have heard that before, that actually it's the decent thing to do, so it should be done. But actually, by making services more accessible and more inclusive, that tends to make them better for everybody, because they become just better services and easier to navigate. I'm really interested in what you say about imagine if you didn't have contacts in the system and you were starting from scratch. And Jodie, I will come to you after Andrew, but I think the imagine if is kind of the heart of customer-centered design, isn't it? It's kind of getting to imagining you are that person who is kind of needing to use this system.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Marvin. Andrew, I'm going to come on to you next. From the state level, how do you think you are doing in terms of kind of your services meeting some of these standards that are required?
Thank you very much. Appreciate the question. I think it's I think we're continuing to improve and do a better job. I think been in my role for around 15 months right now, and for us, I work for obviously Maryland Department of Information Technology, and I'm part of Maryland Digital Service. I head up the Office of Accessibility, and my big focus over these 15 months has been governance, because without governance, we're going to continue to make the same mistakes. We're going to continue to fix one project, test a project, remediate it, make it accessible, and then start all over again. And just this continuous cycle of basically insanity, because you just continue to do the same thing. Now, if you've got governance and infrastructure in place, that's not going to happen. With governance and infrastructure, you're going to be able to recreate good digital processes and create a good customer experience for everyone. So we've that again. Our emphasis has been around policy development. We launched the state's first comprehensive digital accessibility policy back in January. We obviously were kind of sitting in on those listening sessions and finding out what the feds were thinking in relation to the U.S. Department of Justice ADA Title II final rule. We knew that was coming down, so we kind of thought ahead and said, hey, let's raise our accessibility standards. We were using the previous federal standard of 2.0, lining it up with Section 508. We then ahead and moved up to WCAG 2.1. So the jump from 2.0 to 2.1, now we're thinking about mobile devices, because if you think about it, so many of our constituents in Maryland are using their cell phone, they're using their iPhone, they're using their app, they're using their Android device, they're using a tablet to interact with government. And that's the great thing about WCAG 2.1. It factors in mobile and responsive design. We also, within that policy, we also created, we believe, the nation's first accessibility officer initiative, where each executive from every single cabinet level agency would appoint an accessibility officer to their team. And this accessibility officer would act as a liaison across state government with my office. And we started a lengthy training program with those guys. And from there, we created a community of practice where these accessibility officers are learning more and more about accessibility, about governance, about testing, about document accessibility, and just making sure that we creating an accessible digital footprint for all Marylanders to utilize. Then, furthermore, we've really stepped up our efforts around procurement and procurement reform, and probably made some of the most aggressive procurement updates around digital accessibility in the nation, including this final. We have an accessibility holdback. So we're holding back a certain percentage of every IT solicitation, as each month would be, where a vendor would invoice a certain amount, a certain percentage is going to be held back for accessibility retention, so that when a project comes to the end, there's a certain amount of money has been held back, and heaven forbid, there was an issue with a particular IT solution and it wasn't able to comply, there'll be a pot of money there theoretically to go and remediate that issue as well. So, some pretty aggressive language, some pretty aggressive action, creating infrastructure around accessibility. And we created a memorandum of understanding between several agencies, all working together to make sure that we're creating accessible solutions. We're building policies and practices, and that's been our big push.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. I mean, lots of food for thought there. You've got, I wrote down what you said there. I really like your focus on governance. And I love the phrase that you used, without the right governance, it's just a continuous cycle of insanity, and how important that governance is to make sure that you are sharing good practice and not repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Very interesting. We can come back to that again from the state level, how you're kind of listening to what's going to be coming down from the federal kind of initiatives as well. So maybe getting ahead of some of those initiatives that are coming down, moving to mobile services. So really thinking about where your users are, what they're using most in terms of accessing the services. So phones, tablets, for example. And then this concept of having these accessibility officers, I really like that, because not just is it giving it priority and showing that you really care about this, but it's making sure you have that network of people who understand what's working and can really champion accessibility as well. And very interesting in terms of using procurement as a way to kind of drive change. I know that's already being done for areas like sustainability. Interesting to hear you talking about that in this kind of context as well. Great to see that we already have some questions coming in, Sarah. I'll get you in a moment. But Jody, your thoughts. You work with so many different organisations across the public sector. Would you say that what you've heard so far, that's a fair reflection of where you think the public sector is at the moment?
Yes, I think it is. And I'm excited to be in a room full of optimists, though I wish the number that Drew spoke to were higher than 30%. I get to see the entire funnel. So the procurement that Andrew was talking about, so I've been focused on in the public sector space for about 7 years now. And in that time, I've seen the procurement, this bid solicitation documents go from just boilerplate, human-centered language to including specific details, like how are you going to help us achieve specific user outcomes? I was at a kickoff just last week with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and this is just, the team is incredibly forward-thinking, starting from procurement all the way through to ensuring outcomes. And, onward through to the CEXO and other executive orders, where I think that is helping. I think we are seeing folks like Claire Martirano with her strong, powerful voice, telling people this isn't rocket science, you can do it too. It's about, pushing user research and centering users up front in the process and iterating rather than just doing a big reveal. All of these things that Agile espouses. Agile, which says individuals and interactions are valued over processes and tools, reminds me of the theme of our webinar today. So I am absolutely seeing it both in the federal and state level, sometimes even more so at the state level, which is super encouraging. And when we hear Andrew speak, we start to hear more and more about why people like Andrew are joining state digital services teams. So I'm definitely seeing the improvement. The challenge, I would say, is comes when we face situations where there is not a willingness to make that upfront investment in centering users. Let's do that after the fact. That, I mean, you know me, Siobhan, I want to talk to everyone about how do we do this, not just why, but how. The how we do it becomes exponentially more difficult when we wait until the bulk of the service or the product is already developed.
Yeah. Well, Jody, I'm going to come on to how do we do this and what does good user-centered design look like in a moment. But Andrew, I just want to come, we've had a follow-up question to you about, could you expand a little bit on governance? So what does good governance mean to you? And is this about people and putting people in positions, or is it about kind of systems and incentives? Do you have a kind of whole package of things in mind when you talk about creating the right governance?
So that's a great question. So when I think about governance, I'm thinking about people. I'm thinking about systems, and I'm thinking about processes. You've got to have, in my opinion, all three, because if you've got all the people, if you have all the people, you can still be in that crazy, insane cycle of just testing, fixing, going back, doing the same thing over and over again. It's all about creating systems and processes that people can follow and can be repeated. And, you know, you can roll something out statewide. That is the essence of what we're doing here at Maryland Digital Service, is that good governance and putting that in place and creating systems that can be repeatable and usable, and making sure that the digital assets the state is putting out going forward are usable, they're fit for purpose, they look good, and they're accessible.
Thanks, Andrew. So it's not just about having kind of a person in charge, it's about making sure you embed that in the systems and the processes as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. And Jodie, I will come back to this question. My next question is going to be around user-centered design and what it looks like, but I want to take the question from Sarah that's come in. So Sarah, I really like this question because Sarah has said, good afternoon, thank you for your time today. I have one question for the panel, and it's not a low-level ask at all, Sarah, your question, which you're worried about. So Sarah has said, service modernization is creating capabilities for the organization to continuously modernize. So this is kind of this journey that lots of organizations are on across the public sector, their digital transformation journeys and modernizing their services. How do we enable colleagues to be fully part of this journey and to mainstream innovation? I really like this. So how do you, as we are going through this modernization process, ensure that everybody has or feels empowered to be part of this process? And like, do they, for example, I'm going to put this question to all of you, do you think that people feel like they can try new things, and are they scared to fail? What might that mean? Can they put forward their own ideas? Can they be part of this journey where you're really putting users at the heart of everything you do? So how much is innovation in this extent, in this kind of context, really facilitated as we go through these modernization journeys? Andrew, I'll come to you on this one. Any thoughts on Sarah's question?
It's a good question. I think the most important focus is, at least from that accessibility perspective, is making sure that a term coined by Dr. Jonathan Lazar at the University of Maryland is this born accessible approach, and making sure that when you're thinking about human-centered design, and when you're thinking about accessibility, and you're thinking about creating products and solutions, IT solutions for consumers, that these things are born accessible. So that means, and we're trying to do that right now at Maryland Digital Service. So typical accessibility tests, and I'm sure Drew would probably acknowledge it. A lot of time, accessibility folks are getting brought in when front end and back end have been completely developed. Like, here's the system, we're all about to launch next week, please test it. That was the approach that we saw in the past. Here at Maryland Digital Service, we're trying to use this born accessible approach. Yeah. So as the front end has been built out, we're testing for accessibility. We're looking at the components. We're testing the template as the front end has been built out. We're testing all the individual web components that are going to go inside there, creating an accessible components repository. So just a different focus, making sure that accessibility starts at the beginning of the dev cycle versus the end. And I think that's going to be the difference between, accessibility not costing a lot of money and accessibility costing an absolutely excessive amount of money.
Yeah,
because
better to do it up front.
Right, an entire system was built
Absolutely.
and it was not accessible from the start. So the born accessible approach by Lazar is definitely the approach that I would utilize, and it's what we're trying to utilize here at Maryland Digital Service.
Thanks, Andrew. And Drew, you wanted to come in on this point.
I would, thank you. I think that often we see accessibility requirements as a constraint on innovation, and I think that sometimes that is necessarily so. At least from a federal government perspective or state government perspective, some of those constraints help us protect the legitimacy of our governments, because we're protecting the interests of those who are marginalized or disadvantaged. But I think a more promising perspective is to see the opportunity, and I'll use some language that I think everyone on our panel is very familiar with, and that is the perspective that innovation with inclusion leads to better innovation. And we can cite many examples of innovations that accounted for the needs of people with disabilities that make everyone's lives better. Whether we're talking about captions on TV or the curb cuts, if you're a fan of American football, that the huddle was from the advent of a need that the Gallaudet University football team used to huddle so that their opposing team couldn't see their signs as they signed to each other what their play was going to be. So there's so many examples of better inclusion in any measure of inclusion, not only from the standpoint of disability, but those better inclusion, more diversity tends to lead to better innovation. And so I see that as opportunity, whether we're talking about a very specific use case or we're talking about emerging technologies. There really is some fantastic opportunity. And so, but I think we do need both perspectives. There is some constraint, but there's also opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And Jody, you wanted to come in, and just I think Sarah's question in particular was about how do you bring all the colleagues along in this and gather all of that talent when it comes to driving a more inclusive approach?
Yes, and I'm hearing a theme, and I'm going to call it empathy. Empathy for our users. Nava enters a space with clients, and as Sarah referred to them, colleagues with empathy, and in some cases, awe. These are dedicated public servants who have a depth of subject matter expertise, and we can learn so much from them. So human-centered, it means the end user, yes. It also means the colleagues that Sarah is referring to, so they can be fully part of it. And we have a set of delivery principles that we use. I won't recite all of them, but it really is about building trust. And one of the first ways we do that is to actively listen. And to make, when Sarah asks about failure, do people feel like they can try new things? Are they afraid to fail? One of the great things about iteration up front is you try something, you put it out with a small population, you see where you both succeed and fail, and failure gets iterated out. And that includes just, plain language to give a nod to Andrew and his team and many others. And Drew, when it comes to and the born accessible is also something Andrew said, and also to some of the work Drew has got going on. How do we improve the overall accessibility for a range of users? That can be tested early and iterated to improve. So it's active listening, Sarah. It's really honoring the subject matter experts who are on the ground already, taking what we hear from them, developing a shared vision together, putting it out there as a shared vision using their language, using our language, and then in building the actual user needs into that vision as well.
Thanks, Jody. Marvelneen, you wanted to come in. What would you like to add from what you've heard for Sarah in her question?
So I love Jody mentioning the word empathy because it reminds me of a book called Practical Empathy. I just looked it up. It is a little bit expensive. Hopefully you can find a way to get your government agency to fund it. But that's a really good text. And I think finding blog posts about this book is called Practical Empathy. And a colleague, when I was at the Centers for Medicare, Medicaid Services, actually suggested this book to me. And because of that book, I started a program that I called Operation Bear Hug. And it was the middle of the pandemic. So I was not actually seeing or touching anybody, but I literally had a little program for myself to meet as many of the various subject matter experts, as Jody just mentioned, on the ground, the people that really understood the way Medicare payments, the way that service has operated for the past few decades, as we were trying to modernize not just the technology, but the way it was run. And that involved things like virtual, take a coworker to work day. So I'd be like, send me all your Zooms and I will be there with you. So it was a little bit performative, a little bit weird, but it actually worked because they were like, oh, this crazy person is sitting in on my long meetings. Clearly they're interested. Let me introduce them to this other person who's really, really knows exactly about these specific prices for this part of Medicare. And so all of a sudden I developed this, these people now, it was a mutual thing, right? I understood the complexities and the nuances, and they realized that I actually cared about the work that they had dedicated their careers to. And so it was no longer me dragging them along, it was us being on the same bus together. When you talk, I think you said in your question, Sarah, this journey. right? Like, I think it's about being on the journey together and not it being that you kind of like picking people up along the way. So let's start born, right? Let's start it together and then go from there.
Thanks, Marvin. My next question, I think, pulls together lots of the different strands that we've already covered here. So Sarah's question was around bringing people along on this modernization journey. And you've all touched on, I think you've mentioned kind of Drew and Andrew, the compliance rates around particular services and particular websites, for example. Do you all think that as public servants sitting in different agencies and departments, as they are going around their transformation initiatives, are they fundamentally sitting back and thinking, I don't just want to digitalize this process and make sure it's accessible. I want to fundamentally rethink how this service is delivered and make it more accessible and make it more inclusive, which I think probably involves a lot more collaboration behind the scenes, that culture change that some of you were talking about. So my question, I guess, is do you think that public servants are good at taking this opportunity to not just digitalize maybe poor services or poor processes, but to fundamentally change the way things are done? And Jodie, I'll come to you first on this one, because I guess it's to the heart of what is good customer focused design. Do you completely rethink the way a service is delivered?
Yeah, I see it. And again, this, I thought to myself as Marvo was speaking, like how many large government contractors are having conversations about empathy for users and partners? I'm not sure. I have the honor and pleasure of being exposed to very forward-thinking digital services teams inside of the federal and state government, as well as other, people at different stages of that journey, from, an institutional reinforcer all the way through to the most forward-thinking types of clients and partners. And again, I'm going to hearken to where I was last week at this time, which was sitting at a VA technical office, kicking off a new contract. And the team, again, I'm so proud to participate with this team. They are not just telling us, I want strong veteran outcomes. They wanted us to sit with them for 2 days so they could show us how they have fundamentally rethought the contracts and invoicing process, the procurement process, the task order forecast. Like, they have thought through everything, and they're holding themselves accountable to be the best civic tech team in the world. And I think they're pretty darn close. So I see that, and I can't help but be incredibly encouraged and hopeful. And similarly, just yesterday, a contract kickoff with the state of Maryland. And this team is just cannot wait to get started to deliver outcomes for the constituents in Maryland. So, I mean, I am seeing people, the clients, take an opportunity not just to, as Andrew was saying, do it, and usability improvement here and there, which is important, but how do we establish platforms? And some of the teams are calling them platform teams, so that there are reusable components, web design systems that have been tested for accessibility, to Marvo's point earlier, and other ways of doing things differently so that things change at the procurement level forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. Drew, I'll come back to you on this one. Do you see people seizing this opportunity to kind of really rethink everything that's going on behind the scenes, maybe so that you get better outcomes for citizens, more joined up outcomes for citizens in the end?
I do. I think, of course, it is still hit and miss. And I think that it will take some time to see some. Again, there is some imperative from many agency leadership, many agencies leadership. We're seeing more organization around offices of customer experience, for example, where even where some federal employees, some public servants might be inclined simply to make a paper form, a digital form, and that serves the purpose. But seeing that change through the lens of customer experience does certainly help us, prompt us to think more holistically about the beginning to end journey, and where there are connections with other services and other touch points to an agency, so that customer experience is not just this one particular process, but my entire experience with regard to my interaction with an agency or multiple agencies. And so I think some of that shift, and we're seeing that again, I think with many agencies that are shifting to focus more on that view of customer experience and digital experience as part of that. So I don't, we're not seeing, I can't say that I see that everywhere, but we're certainly seeing strong indications that that is more of a priority, and that with some of those organizational changes will prompt more thought and more exploration.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think we're seeing some promising trends.
Thanks, Drew. Andrew and Marvenine, I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is going back to the relatively low levels of kind of compliance and conformity that Andrew mentioned in the beginning. So my question to both of you is, what are the biggest challenges to seeing more improvement? So what are the biggest barriers for public servants to improve? And who is most at risk if we don't get this right? So who are the most vulnerable groups and individuals that we are talking about? Andrew, I'll come to you first.
I obviously would say the most vulnerable folks at risk would be constituents with disabilities and highly likely constituents with significant disabilities, sensory impairments, such as those who are blind and low vision. Here at Maryland Digital Service, we've been really focused on making sure that all Marylanders can access our digital footprint, can go through and complete transactions seamlessly. And to do this, there's been a big push from our senior leaders, from Lily Madigan, from Marcy Jacobs, who heads up our Maryland Digital Service. There's been a real big push on getting user feedback, getting user testing, and a very human-centric approach. And then again, using this born accessible approach where we're making sure that we're testing things before they get anywhere near production. So we're testing things for accessibility, we're testing things from usability. We're completing, for example, where a lot of state governments and municipal governments would shy away from engaging with national disability advocacy groups. And the reason why is they'd be worried about potential lawsuits, that type of thing. With us, it's a very different approach. We're actually engaging with national disability advocacy groups. We work with them. We partner with them. We want to hear from our community. We want to hear if there's a challenge with the site. We want to know about it and see how we can go about it, fix it to make sure these types of issues don't happen again. So we're very engaged with the community, and it's at least in particular with my office, the Office of Accessibility, a heavy focus on making sure we hear feedback from Marylanders with disabilities, and that's something that we're very proud of. And it's going to be a long process. Rome was definitely not built in a day.
And would you say then one of the challenges for other states maybe is that fear of engagement, that actually you might open yourselves up to some very difficult conversations and make yourself more vulnerable in doing this?
I think so. I do think so. But when I sit on panels like this, and when I go around the nation speaking on accessibility and governance, one of my key points is always to talk about we need to make sure that we have our end users engaged in the process when we're building our systems and solutions. End of story. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And for accessibility is for people with disabilities ultimately. And we need to make sure that if we're going to build accessible solutions, we're getting input from individuals with disabilities. We shouldn't be creating things for people with disabilities, and we shouldn't be creating things for people, for all Marylanders without getting that discrete input from individuals with disabilities. And again, the engagement with national advocacy groups for us has been very important, and we're very happy to have that partnership. And I would, for those, if there's any other state accessibility leads out there listening to this, I would say that it is a good idea to engage with national advocacy groups. Because you can find out, you get the pulse of what's happening in the community. You don't often get that sitting in a government office.
Yeah, absolutely. And Marvenine, your thoughts on kind of some of the biggest challenges then for doing this well? And I'm curious, as you're now sitting slightly outside, you're sitting in a private sector organization now, is there anything the public sector can learn from the private sector in this respect as well?
I think there's a lot the private sector can learn from the public sector. I think it's the other way. And I think a big one is what Jody was describing in terms of the way the VA operates. I remember the seeds of that vision back when I was at Veterans Affairs in 2017. And the policies had to be put down, right? People had to, the lawyers and the lawyer adjacent people had to do a lot of writing, a lot of interpreting the existing federal regulations, some of which go back to before computers were a thing, but they now are still over computers because laws. So adjusting those is a thing called the Federal Acquisition, I forget what the rules perhaps, the FAR, the tech FAR. So for all the nerds out there, that's a great document to read and help you fall asleep. But these are the types of things that had to be written, had to be vetted, had to let Congress kind of beat us up a little bit about what was in it and make sure that it was solid. So that's one piece of it. And then you needed a lot of executive buy-in. So you needed leaders from the White House down that believed in this and were willing to keep going at it, coming at it from different angles. You get a no, well, maybe the side door is open. Okay, maybe wait a year, maybe wait for this.
Yeah.
Oh, this crisis happened. This is a good way to tell them how important it is. And this is simply, it takes time. And the thing that the private sector can learn from the public sector is that big changes that are actually impactful and actually help human beings takes time. It's not in the next quarter. It's not even in the next year. It is years. And that baton handoff, right? So I can hear Jody talking about some of these things and I can actually think about who exactly might be in the room because those are people that were either hired or that hired the person that was going to replace them. So that baton passing is another thing. One person usually, or even a team of people, usually cannot operate both in the kind of bureaucracy hacking, guerrilla warfare that you have to do to get these things in place. They're usually not the same temperament or the right temperament for the long haul. And so that willingness to hand off from one to the other, that acknowledgement, it is not a failure in any way that you're not there for 20 years. It's actually a good thing that you know your strengths and that you also know when you're exhausted emotionally, spiritually, hand it off. That's another, I think, lesson that the private sector can learn. You do not have to be a hero forever and ever. It doesn't work that way. And change is it's just hard, right? Like it's a difficult thing to do, but it's worth doing and it's going to take time. And in terms specifically of improving these digital services, one of the things that we talked about at Veterans Affairs was not letting, and US Digital Service more broadly, along with our partners like NAVA, Ad Hoc, other companies, was to not fall into the trap of making it about cost savings. Because the goal is not to save dollars in this penny wise but pound foolish way, right? A lot of the money would actually, we wanted to, and I think have done this, which is plowed it back into call centers. Because your website can be accessible and perhaps 95%, even 99% of the population can now use it because you have a AAA rating, right? In terms of your accessibility standards, you're doing amazing. But 1%, and this is the thing when you're talking about the public sector, 1% of the US population is still 3 million people that you're just going to ignore and just cast. No, you're not going to do that. They have to have a place to call in. They have to have some, again, that one-to-one, that retail kind of aspect of government that they can call and get help and work through processes. So take the money and put it somewhere to help the public.
Thanks, Marlene. Just to the audience, please do get your questions and comments coming in because we haven't got that much longer left. But Andrew, in a moment, just so you can be thinking about this, I'm going to come to you for your thoughts on the challenges and why we're not seeing even more Drew, and why we're not seeing even more progress than we are. But Jody, I want to ask you a very simple question because lots of people have mentioned user-centered design, listening to people, building that engagement in from the start. My very simple question to you, because this is what you do day in and day out, is what does good kind of user-centered design look like? What would your top tips be for people who are listening, who want to do this in the best way they possibly can?
Yeah, there's actually an ISO standard on human-centered design. It was published in 2010, which is right when the public sector, and I'll say venture capitalists, started getting hip to the fact that we need to, quote, meet users where they are. You started to hear that everywhere. I had been slogging at it since the late 90s, early aughts, and I was like, yes, we're finally here. And And I'm saying that because I agree with Marvo. The private sector can be learning from the public sector. There's so much dedication here. So what even is good human-centered design? How do we even define it? Well, the ISO standard says it's an approach to interactive systems development that aims to make systems usable and useful by focusing on users, their needs and requirements, and by applying human factors and usability knowledge and techniques. This approach enhances effectiveness and efficiency, improves human well-being, user satisfaction, accessibility, and sustainability, and counteracts possible adverse effects of use on human health, safety, and performance. I love it. I know that there are councils and committees out there that spend whole conferences years on end trying to define this. I think we can stop there. It's great. Good job, ISO. And then how do we do this? I like to kind of continue to breathe this optimism and possibility into the space, and while also acknowledging that one of my biggest challenges, my team's biggest challenges, are some of the commercial off-the-shelf COTS products that are these monoliths that you have to start to really customize in order to make them work for large populations. But that's a whole other debate that we could get into is, we can't just build custom everything. We have to do large scale systems integration on non-custom products and platforms. And sometimes that can make things challenging. It's very rare that we have a greenfield opportunity. But having said that, and I'm thinking about Sarah's question, how do we get closer to our users? How do we get closer to our stakeholders and make them feel that things are possible? Well, I think of it as a lasagna or a layer cake. Like, there are some steps you can take. I'm hungry. I don't know about you all, but you start by setting up the research. What is the goal? What are you trying to learn? And I imagine talking to people like Andrew, like Marvo. I think I did talk to Marvo about things like this. Set up the study. What do you want to understand? You have a prototype ready. You recruit and screen participants. Andrew talked about getting out there with the communities you're serving. Establish a participant advisory council so you can get access to those users quickly. And this is all within a single sprint, 2 weeks. I'm not talking about 25 weeks or even 6 weeks. Within the cycle of a sprint, we're able to find the users, recruit the right users, interview them. That's the third layer of the cake, is you ask them non-leading questions about their experience. You watch them, and then you analyze and integrate those findings and recommendations into your iteration, into your user stories and backlog. And then it's possible. You might be like, wait, stop. Say that again, Jody. But I'm happy to. There are certainly blog posts on our website about this. There's tried and true processes that enable teams and clients and services to get this work done and do it correctly and avoid the heartache and pain and failure that we see in some of the grid that I'm imagining. Drew has a look at where there are failures and not just accessibility, but also usefulness.
Yeah. Thanks, Jody. And definitely we'll share anything you want us to share in terms of blog posts we can share with the audience. But Drew, I do want to come, because obviously, Jody, that was like a whistle-stop tour through and demystifying a little bit what this customer-focused design might look like. But Drew, I'm really curious, because you started with the kind of percentages around relatively low levels of compliance. So what we've heard so far in the conversations are, I think there are challenges around leadership, challenges around governance, challenges around the culture. Also, what Jody was saying there, I think challenges around people not understanding maybe where to start by even identifying the users they need to speak to. So from your perspective, what do you think are the biggest barriers? Why hasn't more progress been made on this?
Yeah, I'll focus on a couple that you've mentioned already, and that we have mentioned already. Leadership endorsement is probably the top of the list in terms of helping an organization move the needle in culture. And so prioritization among leaders and leaders that are willing to hold themselves and their organizations accountable to ensure that we're meeting accessibility priorities. So that, certainly is a big one. The other, I think you kind of finished on, and Jody spoke to, that there is still an awareness and a knowledge gap. And even if while we're seeing some improved priority in some of these big initiatives on digital experience and digital experience first, or digital first experience, we might have a willingness, but we might not have the know-how. And so one of our biggest problems is that if you were to peruse some position descriptions for federal positions in IT, you would not likely find any requirements in their skills and capabilities for accessibility. We're not asking for those skills. And so we're not signaling to academic institutions or boot camps, wherever, our professionals are getting their skills, they're not getting accessibility skills as part of that. And it's not that it's hard, it's not difficult, but it still does take some know-how. And the more sophisticated the technology, or the more know-how you need in order to make that accessible. Again, not difficult changes, but it does take change. And so that's where some of our biggest challenges is just we do have a big gap in the awareness and know-how.
And do you think maybe that goes back to what Marvinine was saying, that it's going to take time? You kind of need that tipping point of people who are doing this in the digital profession for it then to become widespread, so that it then becomes part of future recruitment, etc.
So it certainly does, and again, some of that comes from leadership requiring, for instance, that we incorporate into our mandatory training that everyone should know about the accessibility requirements, and more specific to particular roles, whether it's communications and public affairs, or every federal employee, like most federal employees, create some amount of electronic content that might make its way to the web or gets distributed widely. Well, we need to know how to make that accessible, but even more so for our web developers and our systems developers and designers that need to know even more particulars about accessibility. And so it takes leadership engagement to make that a requirement, to encourage us to get the skills that we need, and to ensure and to take care of our people, to arm them with that knowledge.
Yeah. And also, I'm always curious. So you have the executive orders. My apologies, because obviously I'm speaking as a UK kind of person here, not fully understanding how the system works. But what are the consequences for organisations and agencies who don't comply? What are the immediate kind of consequences for them? And then, Andrew, I'll come to you. I've seen you've got your hand up. But Drew, what are the consequences for agencies and departments that don't comply?
Yeah, that comes back to statutory mechanism for enforcement and consequences, and there just aren't many, or there's not much of a statutory consequence, or legal. The biggest ramifications come in terms of legal liability in the U.S. courts. There's a huge volume of case law. But some development over the past couple of years in a case involving the Department of Justice in the 12th Circuit, anyways, there is some precedent that a private citizen has an individual right of action to file suit against an agency. Otherwise, some of the consequences is more in appearance. And the annual report that Congress has required that we produce helps with transparency and awareness. And so that's, some of the consequence. And then otherwise, it comes down to, again, agencies holding themselves accountable. But we have some recommendations in the annual report that we produced to Congress to consider, actual legislative actions to that effect. But anyways, I'll pass it off.
No, thanks, Drew. That's really interesting. So there are potential legal consequences at an individual level, but also the reputational kind of issues as well could be a driver. Andrew, did you want to come in? You had your hand up there.
I did, and I was just thinking about something that Drew said, and wanted to piggyback. I think that executive leadership at the state level, I think executive leadership buy-in is absolutely crucial, and that's something we're very, very fortunate to have at the state of Maryland. Starting from the very top executive of the state, moving down to like our secretary Katie Savage. There's been so much investment around accessibility. Setting up an office of accessibility, one of the first in the nation, and it's been fantastic to see all the effort that's put in. Something else that I noticed that Drew said in relation to recruitment, I think recruitment is definitely a challenging issue for digital accessibility. There's a distinct lack of folks out there that do this work, and the real good candidates are basically bouncing backwards and forwards between private sector. In all honesty, that's what I seem to have found. You will find very good accessibility folks in the feds and within the state, but you find like there's a lot of talent heading towards private sector just because they're thinking that's the focus is obviously compensation. And something I think we've done a good job at the state of Maryland as well is we've created a really unique internship program for digital accessibility, and build out a really solid curriculum. And I think it's going to help us create the next generation of IT internship, this IT accessibility internship. I think it's going to create the next generation of IT accessibility professionals. I think that needs to be. I mean, I don't know if it could be pulled off in the feds. I know the feds have quite some constraints around hiring, but at least at the kind of the state and the municipal government level, I think it could be a good approach as well. And also potentially looking to reskill existing IT staff. We see some UX folks jumping into accessibility. We see some software developers jumping into accessibility, but there's definitely a shortage of qualified folks. I'm sure Drew is experiencing that at the federal level. So,
yeah, thanks, Andrew. That issue of the difficulties of recruiting and retaining great digital talent is a broad challenge, I think, and having within that then people who understand accessibility within that profession, even more of a challenge, I think, in the public sector. I just want to reply to Sarah very quickly and say, yes, please do, Sarah, send in your questions behind the scenes and we will see if we can get those answered for you. But we've got two final questions coming in and I think they're connected. So I'm going to put these questions to all four of you, and this will probably be our final round of questions. So Amadou Barrow has said, guided by your people-centric digital strategies. So his question is, have some of your employees led their own innovation initiatives? I think it's going back to how much can people put forward their own ideas, but how have debates over priorities been resolved? And I like that question because Janelle has also asked, how do we address a situation where ministries and departments are willing, but they do not have the resources, either manpower, skills, or money, given that public officers may be inundated with things to do with other operations? So how do you prioritize this as an issue? And I guess it goes back to that, how do you make the case for investment in this when there are so many other challenges facing public servants? So I'm going to start with Marvenine on this. So any examples of where you think initiatives have been led by employees themselves, but also that question of prioritizing investment in accessibility in IT?
So I think two things, and I'll try to keep it quick so that I don't take up all the remaining time. One is, I think in terms of initiatives, yes, but it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of shuttle diplomacy. It takes a lot of building up support from other people and getting an executive sponsor, right? Whether it's a director level or in the US federal government, the senior executive service level, getting somebody with a lot of clout to buy into your idea. And that's the ideas that I've seen be successful, is kind of building up a groundswell that also has that top cover. And in terms of prioritization, I think, again, it's a long game. And I think there's a sense of, are we going to put our money where our mouth is or not? And I think there's a little bit of a challenge that we have to both kind of instigate from the citizenry to kind of rise up and say, do we actually care or not? Because we have no shortage of money when we, are experimenting on bomber jets that we never actually fly and that get mothballed for billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. But then when we want to talk about an extra million or two to make sure that citizens can access things or that people are upskilled, all of a sudden there's a fiscal crisis. So I think there's a little bit of that kind of, again, I think most of us on this call most likely live in places that call themselves democracies, and so we kind of have to hold our elected officials and our, especially from local all the way up, to account and say, do we actually believe in this stuff or not? Because if we don't, that's fine. It's horrible. It's fine, but let's stop lying to ourselves.
Thanks, Marlene. Andrew, your reflections on prioritizing these issues.
I think that we have to keep the human being as the center of this. And as we're going about delivering services, I think we need to make sure that we're that it's the human centered, and from an accessibility perspective, making sure that all end users can interact with government services, and that we're planning and thinking ahead to make sure that all of our constituents are being cared for and aware, and they all have equal and appropriate access. And I think that's the big priority for us.
Thanks, Andrew. Jody, your thoughts on this? And I guess this comes back to something you said, which is you're not just investing in accessibility, you're investing in making the services better overall, aren't you? So there's a kind of benefit, a really broad benefit to doing this well.
Yes, and Amadou, and I forgot the other individual's name. Thank you for those questions. So the question is, I documented it, is have some of your folks led their own innovation efforts, and also, and let's just follow that thought through to the other question, which is, let's say they have done, and the leadership becomes willing, but does not have the money to do it. So the way this does get tricky, but the ways I have seen it work now, NAVA is we're not a government agency. We do have our own way of doing this. I'm not going to apply NAVA's way. What I'm going to tell you is what I've seen work in federal and state agencies when this phenomenon occurs. People have an idea. It's a great one. How do we get it implemented beyond the initial idea and prototype? Some things I've seen happen, and again, in the US, is how do you find some path to procurement, or how do you find some way to put that innovative idea, that solution that has worked, onto some existing funding source? Unfortunately, that's going to be the only way it works, is to find that, and you would want to escalate that up to your leadership to say, hey, how do we have this thing, it's working, can we put this onto some existing contract? Can we get this into an existing program? I know that sounds really hard, and that's the thing about the I word, innovation. It's often talked about, it's often celebrated, but it is really hard work. And Marvo has talked about being in it for the long haul, and just getting scrappy and trying to find some path to actually getting the funds you need, and therefore the buy-in you need to make that work.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. And Belinda has come in with a late question. Belinda, we won't have time to answer it fully, but I will ask Andrew if you could share the tech internship resources that the state of Maryland has to offer. We'll do that behind the scenes afterwards. Andrew, we'll connect with you. So,
Absolutely.
Drew, I'm going to come to you, the final kind of thoughts on this. Either have you any examples of people leading innovation themselves, but also your sense of how would you prioritize and make the case for investment?
I do see some really marvelous attempts and individuals who are making attempts to innovate, and it's to solve their individual problems, but they see the bigger impact that their innovations can have. An example, I have a colleague at the General Services Administration. Not part of my office, not has his core work has nothing to do with accessibility primarily, but as part of his work, he's developing and helping others develop presentations, and was finding himself giving a lot of guidance on how to make sure that those presentations are accessible. He used a generative AI tool, a custom GPT, to give it extra instruction, to provide guidance to help some of his colleagues tend to generate more accessible presentation content. And it's not perfect, but but still, some experimentation at innovation to help along with that. On the question of prioritization, I think that when we have these arguments or the conversations about prioritizations become more contentious when we tend to think about accessibility after the fact. So when we're trying to bolt it on, but the fact is, in my opinion anyway, is that we don't have to compromise. We don't have to choose either security imperatives or accessibility imperatives. Even when it comes to functionality or a very mission specific initiative, we don't have to compromise accessibility or choose to do less of the mission or less of a functionality because we choose to incorporate accessibility. If we do that from the beginning, if we integrate accessibility from the very earliest stages of conception about that whatever that mission initiative or functionality for an application is, and I think that very small and simple changes can add up to great effect. And so it's just a small change in the way that I design something or the way that I develop something, in an electronic document, making sure that I'm using programmatic headings, in a web asset, making sure that everything is keyboard accessible. Those things are not, in essence, not really difficult. But as long as we do that from the beginning, if I'm trying to remediate after the fact, then of course my costs just become exponentially greater. And that's when I have the conversation about well, how do I prioritize? Of course, that you're talking about something that's much more costly at that point. So I guess, I hope that doesn't feel like a dismissal, but I really feel that there doesn't need to be compromise as long as we're thinking about and incorporating accessibility early enough.
I really like that answer, Drew, because it goes back to that. It doesn't have to be an either or. If you take into account all of these issues from the start of a new policy process or a new policy thinking, then you should be able to do all of this in the round. Whether you're talking about a cyber-led initiative or an accessibility-led initiative, you can do all of these things together. And you mentioned there using AI and new tools. I think we could have had a whole nother webinar, I think, on whether new technologies like generative AI will actually be a help or a hindrance to accessibility. So maybe that should be part 2 of our conversation. I am just looking at the clock. I think we have sadly come to the end of our time. That conversation went so quickly. So thank you so much to the audience for sending in so many great questions. Those that we didn't get to answer fully, we will make sure that we do pick those up now behind the scenes. And I will be putting those to our speakers and seeing if they're happy to give us a bit more information on some of those. But I would like to say a very, very big thanks to Drew, to Jody, to Andrew, and to Marvenine. Thank you so much for lending us all of your expertise and giving us so much of your time. We have sent a very short questionnaire to everybody who registered today, all of you that were watching. If you don't mind just taking a couple of minutes to fill in that questionnaire, it means we will always continue to give you the webinars on the topics that are of most use to you and most helpful to you. I should have said at the beginning that this webinar is all kind of part of a series of things we are doing leading up to an event that Global Government Forum will be doing in Washington in spring. So please do keep your eyes out for that on the Global Government Forum website. We were there earlier this year and we will look forward to coming back again next year as well. To Nava, thank you so much for being our great knowledge partner today. And we will send to everybody who registered, everybody who is able to watch live or not, the video from today. So you can watch it all again, you can share it with your colleagues, and there will be an article written in a couple of weeks with the key messages coming out of today's conversation as well. But thank you so much, everybody. I really enjoyed that conversation. So much there to learn and so much more, I think, that needs to be done as well going forward. I look forward to seeing you all again very soon on another one of our webinars. Enjoy the rest of the day over there in the United States. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.